They don't need to be unmuted. I don't see Colin, just John Wynn's through. Oh, this is where I want it.
Oh, there's Colin.
There's Colin.
Hi, Ravi.
Hi.
And I was in, but I got out because I wasn't sure if I was in the right meeting. So, and I guess now we have sound.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I hear you beautifully.
I need the light because I got my notes. Yeah, this is fine.
Hi, John Wins. How are you?
So, is there a way to see who all is on Zoom?
Yeah, yeah.
Hello, Colin.
Hi, John. Long
Colin?
time no see.
Yes.
So you're here to hear Ravi speak.
Be right there.
Yes, I am. Although I'm still collecting British West Indian.
Oh, okay, one of your.
Well,
All right.
You missed a really interesting talk on the RAF earlier, the RAF in India. It was fascinating.
Yes, yeah, I wanted to watch that, but I thought it was, we'd have to do it later. But
The good news, the
I
good
didn't know
news
that
is,
these were Zoom meetings live, so.
well, the good news is it's recorded, and
Wide variety.
somehow,
Okay.
as if by magic, through the SEAPEX website, I think you'll be able to see the talks from earlier and the one tomorrow. So, and don't ask me how it's going to work, but it will hopefully work. So, Ravi, are you
Yes.
ready to entertain us?
I sure can, if it works for everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on what part of the world you are in. I'm Ravi Vora, and because we have such a small group, I was going to do a quick poll about who are the collectors of stamps and who are the interested in history, but I think that's probably premature. And the thing I was going to mention is this is somewhat of an experiment of trying to develop series of stories about the history of the relationship between the United States and India using historical and philatelic documents. So in a way, there are multiple stories on different facets of the history. And in a way, this presentation is kind of an experiment. So we'll see what feedback or level of interest there is, and question and answer, I think, are definitely toward the end. I want to also acknowledge my thanks to a number of friends and fellow collectors who have helped me immensely. And errors and omissions are all my fault or my responsibility. So that with that disclaimer, I don't know whether we can go to the slides. Okay.
You're right, you can take the next
Okay, so yeah, no, I don't.
one. I was gonna say, it's up to you if you want.
No. I think
Okay.
we're gonna follow the protocol here.
Okay. Go ahead.
So, as the title suggests, this is a story or stories about the relationship between India and the United States in the 19th century. I just wanted to show the background of the map interlinking North America, or Americas with Asia and India. And what you see, the swirls are typically sailing routes from 18th century onwards. So I need to figure out how to get to the next slide. Carol, I need you. Okay. Okay.
Click on, it should be on.
So should we, this one?
Or, let's see. Okay. Come on,
We are figuring out how to
we had it working.
change slides.
We had it working earlier. There we go. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
just
Thank you.
use your remote right there.
Okay, that's right.
And yeah, hold it up there. Okay.
Oh, okay. So overall outline of the presentation, we're going to do a little bit of an introduction to see how this presentation is formatted. Our first focus is going to be really the mercantile trade and maritime between these countries. And that was really one of the major driving forces that created a number of historical events. Next, we are going to cover briefly the role of the U.S. Consular Services. Surprisingly, that happened as early as 1780s or 1790s. And then we transition to the role and the history of the American missionaries in India, which is quite interesting and enriching. Then we transition to the growing interest in America and Americans, both about the Sanskrit, the language equivalent of Greek. And then in the latest 19th century, there was a growing interest on India's socio-cultural, religious, theological practices. And then we'll come to conclusions, a summary. So the way it's structured, I'm going to give you a little bit of a highlight of what to expect. So there you're going to see the information about the rates and the routes of the documents or covers are printed in blue. All the historical information that one gets, all the stories are printed in red. So that's a good way to remember the difference between the two. The way we are structuring each of the presentation slide is that first we will relate to it's mostly mail between India and US, except for one or two. The postal history will refer to the ships, the routes, and the rates to the extent I was able to determine or find out. And then more importantly, we'll talk about the content or information containing those letters or documents that came with it. Mercantile trade really will focus first on the routes. Before 1840 or before the steamship came, typically most of the ships between US and India went through Cape of Good Hope, a long journey. It used to take as long as 7-8 months in the turn of the 18th century to less than 50 days by 1860s. Also, after 1840s and the advent of the steamship, there was a growing shorter route, which was to sail via Suez from India and a land route to Alexandria before the Suez Canal was built, then on to England, and from England to US. Mercantile trade and maritime were profitable most of the time, but they were expensive and risky. We'll see the examples. Somehow India's trade relationship and maritime activities were intertwined with China, and there were some challenges and opportunities. Then we'll quickly cover the role of the US Consular Services, both in Calcutta, which was the major trading port, and Bombay. And then we'll touch on the religion and Sanskrit and theology. So I just wanted to kind of show you that actually the trading from the United States side was really primarily done from Rome.
295 South Warwick.
Salem was a major port,
Keep
and
right, and then
you could see that there were a number of sailings that took place. This one particularly shows most of the sailings through Cape of Good Hope to India and Asia, but they also went all the way up to Russia. What it doesn't show are some infrequent sailings through Cape Horn going west and then coming through Far East and into India. So this is one of the earliest mail that I have seen. It's by the second earliest. And it's only a filled address panel. We unfortunately don't have a letter content. It was sent in 1807 from Bombay to Providence, Rhode Island. It actually, we think it went through via Cape Horn rather than Cape of Good Hope, because it actually landed in the United States in Savannah, Georgia. There's a cancellation. And then from there, it was sent by land to Providence. Now that's very unusual. Most of the mail in 19th century from India ended up coming to the East Coast, New York, Boston, infrequently Philadelphia. Just to show you how the sailing was slow and long, this particular letter took about 7 months. The letter was sent privately on a ship from India, from Bombay, so there is no postage paid in India. But when it landed in Savannah, Georgia, and entered the U.S. Post Office, U.S. Post Office charged 77 cents. A lot of money then. It included 2 cents that the captain of the ship got, and so that motivated them to bring the letters because they made a lot of money. But the letter rate to send it from Georgia to Providence, Rhode Island, was 37.5 cents for single weight, and double weight was 75 cents, and that added up to 77 cents. So actually the mercantile trade is noted between India and US all the way back to the 1780s, shortly after American independence. This particular letter came from a gentleman or trader called Frederick Rupe. I have no information on that and not been able to find it, so it's a mystery about who he was. It's addressed to a very famous, well-known American trading firm called Samuel Arnold's and Company in Providence, Rhode Island. And actually they had extensive trading business and correspondence worldwide from late 18th century to the mid 19th century. This actually, I showed this to show, it's a very busy slide, but basically it shows the type of commodities that were traded and the sailing routes that took place. I won't go into a lot of details on that, but basically most of the trading items of interest to Americans from India were spices. There was a fair amount of interest in indigo and other commodities that was hard to get elsewhere. And from American side, exports were not many. Typically, oftentimes, Americans ended up using silver Mexican dollars to pay for it. But there were some unusual export opportunities. We will learn about it in the due presentation. So we are going to start with an interesting relationship of trade between the United States and India and China. This is one of the earliest letters sent from Canton, China to Calcutta. It was sent by ship for Hope by Captain Dudes. It took about 60 days for it to reach Calcutta, which is quite long, considering the travel distance wasn't that far. And the postage was essentially charged once it landed in India, just like in US. The ship captain that brought the letter to Calcutta got paid 2 annas, and then it was delivered within Calcutta from the ship where it landed, 5 annas. So that's kind of the way it goes. Now, the letter is very interesting, and it has all to do with early 19th century, US had a number of disputes related to trade embargoes, both with France and the United States in particular. And US had just imposed an embargo to trade with English trades. And so what had happened is that the ships that would have gone to India or Calcutta had to be rerouted to Canton, China. And this particular letter is from a very prominent American textile importer. And he was trying to reach his trading partners and ship owners, ship captain in Calcutta, could not send it directly through the mail to Calcutta because the ships were embargoed. So he writes to his agent in Canton, China, saying, I'm trying to convey a message to my trader and my ship captain in Calcutta that US has lifted the trade embargo in 29th of August, 1809, and that they should be able to conduct trading and sail from Calcutta as soon as this message can get to them. What's interesting, to show you how communication was slow, it took almost 9 months for the American traders and ship captain in Calcutta to learn that trade embargo had been lifted, and now it was safe to travel. This is really a letter from an American trader in 1831. He writes to his cousin, and this has more to do with opium trade, which was one of the most flourishing, fast-growing, and most profitable trade. Another story about India's role in opium trade, that East India Company and the English traders made billions of dollars in those times. There was some dispute with the Chinese by the British, but Port of Canton was closed to American ships, and East India Company had effectively wanted the monopoly, so they would not allow American ships to take opium from India to sell to China. Part of the reason behind all of that is because at that time, there was a lot of demand for silk and tea from China. And most of the Chinese really didn't want anything until opium became a large commodity of interest, through the, anyway, so Americans had to spend all their silver dollars to buy these commodities. So they were looking for a way to replace using silver dollars, and opium was one option. So this particular trader writes to his cousin saying he's optimistic that East India Company will open up the trade. This particular letter was sent by ship parachute. Turns out it also went through Cape of Good Hope, but it did face some heavy gales and almost sank in Bay of Bengal, but survived. The postage rates, once it reached the US, kept changing. You still had to pay 2 cents for the ship captain, and then 25 cents was the domestic postage to send it from New York to Philadelphia. This is another political event that affected the ship captains and traders between India and the United States. It had to do with the Franco-American crisis. This particular letter was sent on a ship from Calcutta directly to Philadelphia, which was uncommon because most ships actually went to Boston or New York. And for a very short period of time, in 1834-35, the Philadelphia Post Office used a special rig cancel, a rig ship. You can see that in a rectangle with a full masted sailing ship cancel and a Philadelphia cancel. Fairly scarce, only 10 examples are known from India. And again, the postage was 2 cents for ship captain. The domestic postage had been reduced to 18 3/4 cents. The writer is a new trader called Lombard, who writes to brother. It took him 114 days, he wrote, to arrive in Calcutta from Philadelphia. And he had a bet about how soon he can get there. And he won $50. Guys, $50 was a lot of money. Interestingly, how entrepreneurial he was, he probably had carried some cured meat for his own survival, but he saved some and sold it for a profit. There were active reports about a major Franco-American dispute, and that actually delayed his shipping back. And I'll explain what the Franco-American dispute was and why he was afraid to leave Calcutta to come to US. Well, what had happened is that after the Napoleonic War, France had agreed to a compensation of $25 million to the United States in 1831. Now, they signed that treaty under which they would pay that money. However, the French court and the parliament basically dragged their feet. They did nothing. They never paid. They kept saying, oh, yes, of course we'll pay. But nothing would happen. Finally, the Congress, US Congress and President got fed up. They decided to send the Secretary of State and an American naval ship to France. He was again given false hopes. So there were serious threats about United States starting a war with France. And the ship captain in Calcutta heard about this and he said, I don't think I'm gonna sail back home because he's afraid he's gonna be caught by French Navy. He would never see his family again. And he asked his brother to take care of his family in case if he never made it. It's amazing how global events touches Americans all over the world. This is another interesting letter where this particular trader from Calcutta in 1836 writes a letter to Augustine Hurd. Now, those of you who know the history of American traders, Augustine Hurd was one of the most famous, most successful trader, primarily in China. He tried to develop trading business in India, but was not successful. This particular friend of his writes to him saying, you may want to consider trading opium, non-Indian opium for Chinese tea, and thereby you don't have to use silver dollars. This also went by ship Dover. It took 164 days. That's a lot shorter by the 1836 than 7 months. And the domestic postage was the same as the previous letter. This is an interesting ingenuity that we can see our Americans' this interest in developing exports and trading. This letter actually was sent privately on an American ship for Florence via Cape of Good Hope. Because it was hand delivered in Boston, there was no local postage, but ship captain earned 6 cents in that case. There's a cancellation of that mark. The letter is from a friend of Augustine Hurd, who also was an equestrian. And he had just reached Calcutta to start some trading business. Interesting, he writes in detail about how unpleasant his journey to Calcutta from Boston was, because the captain was slovenly, bully, and it was an unpleasant journey. However, he did find out that there was a great demand for Arabian and American horses. And he asked Augustine Hurd, said, if you send me some American horses, we can triple the money. So, it's, I mean, no one would ever, at least I never thought there would be any business about exporting horses to India. These are some interesting tidbits that we learned. Now we get to the point where India's exports become very important to American textile industry. The picture or the drawing you see on the right is the manufacturing facility for making calico cloth by a company called Merrimack Manufacturing Company. By 1840s, they were the largest calico cloth manufacturer in the United States. Look at how impressive the facility is. And they needed indigo for dyeing the calico cloth. The jeans some of us wear kind of is a good reference point. Their demand for indigo was so huge, and India provided some of the best quality indigo. They had put their own agent in Calcutta to make sure that he got the best quality at the lowest price. So this letter is from the agent, and he confirms that he has bought the best quality of indigo at the lowest price, and the shipment of 75 chests worth $20,000 were sent. I mean, $20,000 of shipment of indigo is a huge amount. And so this particular letter, by this time, your P&O, English Steamshipping Company, chartered or given special license by East India Company to sail between India and United Kingdom. The typical route was from Calcutta via Suez and land route to Alexandria, and then from Alexandria it would go to an English port, either to Marseille or to one of the English ports directly to Malta. And from England, then it would be transferred by transatlantic route to Boston. But you can see now the travel time is much shorter. The steam shipping and the efficiency of the postal service made the shipping time to less than 55 days. The postage was a little complex. The writers paid 14 annas that covered the domestic postage in Calcutta as well as postage up to London. They use an agent, Baring Brothers. Baring Brothers are one of the oldest banking and trading firm going back to 16th century in London, very famous. They even represented American government for a period of time. So they basically, as their agent, paid 2.5 shillings to send the letter to Boston, and there they paid 6 cents to the ship captain. That tradition continued. This is one of the more fascinating letters I came across. The history this writer called William Goodwin writes is about a New Year's party at Ice House. Now, do you guys know what Ice House is? We're going to talk about it. But an American teenager who had just come there maybe earlier in the year was working at the Ice House, but at the New Year's Eve party, he was accused of murdering another young man, most likely an American. And there was a sensational case, and they expected execution. What is interesting is that my research showed that in England, there was already a movement called Victorians Against Gallows, meaning they were against capital punishment, even going back to the 1850s. They actually went to East India Company or sent a plea that please spare this young man from execution. There's no proof one way or the other, but we don't think that East India Company paid any attention to this group. Now you see the picture of the Ice House where this murder took place. And that's a picture contemporary of 1851, actually a drawing. But in reality, American ingenuity was such that they were the first to figure out that there was a big market and need for ice in Calcutta, because most of the Englishmen used to be having ice with their gin and tonic. And Calcutta in summer or most of the time, pretty hot and muggy, and gin and tonic just doesn't taste the same. But guess what? The Englishmen never figured out you could actually export ice. But American ingenuity figured out that, in New England, they used to save blocks of ice in the basement covering sawdust. And so that's if we can save ice almost year around, surely we can ship ice to India. And so in 1833, that's the first reported export of ice from Boston to India. And that becomes so profitable, so successful that within the next 18 years, they built ice houses in Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras. So interesting story. We won't go into the postal routes and rates. You can talk about it later. This is one of the more fascinating letters I have seen. It's a sailing of a Reverend Samuel Fisk Green, who was an American missionary and a doctor in India, South India and Ceylon. He traveled by ship Jacob Perkins from Boston to Madras, or took 134 days. But here's what he did. He hand drew the map of the globe, Eastern and Western Hemisphere, right? And if you carefully note, there are axes on the route the ship took. Each X represents the location of the ship at every week. So he actually plotted to show to his family, and on the left you see the longitude and the location of the ship every week. It's one of the most fascinating. On the lower right corner, I'm showing you roughly where the position of his ship was when he wrote this letter. Actually, he wrote this letter on the ship about 2 days before it arrived in Madras. Now, this is such an interesting thing. So we have 2 slides. This one just shows you his journey. By 1847, sailing, even though it took long, wasn't all that bad. So we won't go into the details about the letter that was hand carried. Took longer, 210 days. But he wrote on board, clearly missed his family. he very in detail wrote about sumptuous meals they got every day, about 3 or 4 meals a day, and things like pancakes, fried ham, sliced beef, macaroni, pea soup, tapioca pudding, coffee. I mean, this is almost like a luxury liner, guys. I don't know about you, but if I were sailing in 1840s, this would be like a, luxury travel. But he did have some distractions, squealing rats, spiders, and ducks, and flies. I mean, it almost made tolerable by the food and coffee he got. So anyway, that's pretty fascinating. Now we're going to talk about, you see a lot of sailing took place, right? So one of the things I was always curious about is what was made it so lucrative for young men to sign up to be sailors or to, be on the ships. This is an interesting original letter from a ship captain to the ship owner Goodwin. He makes a meticulous accounting of the expenses for the ship's journey originating from Montego, Jamaica, went to Mobile, Alabama, to Havre, France, and Calcutta. In a way, it shows that the ships were opportunistic, right? They would basically look for cargoes for the next nearest destination, and that kept going on. And he makes a very detailed inventory of even then the exchange rate. He even put it in. Just look at the exchange rate in 1856. $1 was equal to 1 rupee, 1.79 rupees. As a comparison, today, $1 is equal to about 74 rupees. A huge deflation, right? Now, one of the highlights is the salaries. Captains were not really paid. They were given profit sharing from trading. So, and actually was quite lucrative. So captains would rather have a percentage of the profit from the export of goods they carried. But the rest of the crew were paid. The highest was obviously first mate because he would be second in command, $40 a month, which was a fairly princely sum. Interestingly, the second highest was not the second mate, but it was a carpenter at $28. Now you wonder, why would a carpenter make more money than anybody else? But if you think about it, most of those were wooden ships, and it was not uncommon that carpenters were in big demand for maintaining and repairing wooden masts and other things. The lowest one was a seaman. Actually, the cooks made quite a good money too. I think cooks were making like 25 bucks because if you don't feed your crew well, you're not going to get too many people to continue doing that. This one had a very complicated journey from Calcutta. It went by Suez to Alexandria, and there in Alexandria, it was deposited in a British post office. So there's an Alexandria post cancellation. From there to London to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. It was traveled by a P&O ship to Liverpool, and from Liverpool by an American packet to New York. The postage was getting more complex, and America had inflation. It had gone up to 75 cents, of which 54 cents was credit to England under the Anglo-American rate postal treaty. Now we can talk about the consular relationship in United States and India. Actually, President Washington appointed the first American consul for Benjamin Joy. It took him 2 years to get to Calcutta because even then the imports of spices and other things from India were very lucrative. So they said, yeah, we need to have somebody there. When he arrived in Calcutta after 2 years, after being his appointment, East India Company simply refused to recognize him as a government representative. But as a concession, they said, you can act as a commercial agent, just like anybody else, but you will not represent the government, because the relationships were still pretty, fragile. So we have two correspondents from consuls in Calcutta. The one on the left is a vice consul called Adam Freer to his counterpart in Thomas Espinal in London. And nothing exciting about the letter, but the rates and routing The letter is about helping out an American citizen who was seeking a small claim that he was able to get him. And apparently there was an expense of ₹2 postage incurred by husband-in-law, and so he had sent him that money. Kind of very mundane, but it just shows you that even then, U.S. consulars, staff try to help Americans abroad. The second one on the right is more philately interesting cover. It's a cover from U.S. Consul General in Calcutta. It had some heavy shipping documents. The documents I don't have access to, but I understand they are in the archives of Mystic Seaport Museum. But there was such a heavy documents that it cost ₹3 postage. So that's pretty heavy. The shipping was pretty fast, only 42 days. British Post Office got 5 shilling 1 pence credit, and US collected 64 cents. Now we move to US consular history in Bombay. Actually, the first consul was set in 1838. But here's the more interesting thing. One on the left is a cover to the first Indian who was appointed as a vice consul to US vice consul in Bombay in 1852. He was a very famous Parsi merchant called Dosabai Marwanji. Those of you who collect early letters may see him as a trader or an agent. He was agent to a lot of Americans, so he was very well known. The cover is kind of a mystery in terms of race and routing because the sender from Greensboro, North Carolina only put 3-cent postage stamp, which was only for domestic postage. So by the time it went to New York, it said, well, it actually needs 42 cents. It was not paid, so it was returned back to return for the postage due. Then we think that the cover actually ended up when the writer got it back, he decided most likely to send it by diplomatic pouch to London because there are no other markings. And then there's a manuscript marking of 1-S, which is 1 shilling. And that was the amount that was probably due to British Post Office to send it from London to Bombay. Now we look at the cover on the right, 1858. Thomas Biddle had just recently died in 1857, dysentery. And he was succeeded by, Thomas Biddle succeeded him. Interestingly, the letter was sent to him, it's a local letter, at Government House in Parel. Well, I found a picture of the Government House in Parel. It looks pretty nice to me. And that is in the suburb of Parel. Those of you in Bombay will recognize that. And apparently he must be in good terms with the governor to be able to receive mail or stay there. Now here we can look at more specific role U.S. consuls played in Bombay. This particular is a pair of letters from agents of an American shipping company. And their letters are addressed to U.S. consul in Bombay from Liverpool, both of them. And the correspondence has to do with the fact that the ship captain had suddenly died in Bombay. And there was a need to do proper transfer and appointment of a new captain, and there were going to be expenses led. So this letter to the U.S. consul in Bombay from the shipping owner's agent in Liverpool requests the U.S. consul to appoint the first mate Graham as the ship captain because the previous captain had died. And the letter went through, by this time, the Suez route was very popular and common. And look how short a time it took. It only took 16 plus or minus days to go from London, Liverpool to Bombay. It was a double weight letter, so to pay 2 shillings and 2 pence. The letter on the right is a sister letter. The only interesting thing is, besides that, it requests that U.S. consul hand over 500 pounds that was sent by American ship through the bankers to the new captain. But here's a more interesting and intriguing comment. It said in a note to the consul that please forward this letter to U.S. Consul Palau, Peru, if the ship has sailed from Bombay. Now, what is interesting to us as historians is it shows that there actually was sailing or maritime trade between Bombay and South America, which is really still not many letters are known between India and South America. But at least it gives us a proof that there was some trade and correspondence. Now we go to the missionaries. This is a famous missionary called Munger. He and his wife Maria served Western India in Bombay province region from 1834 till he died in 1865. He obviously had an active support from East India Company. By this time, East India Company realized that the missionaries were important in enforcing and expanding the civil administration of India. So they needed as many Indians to be converted to Christianity, to be educated and be converted to the Western English culture so they can work as civil servants. And so they really supported missionaries. There were more missionaries from America by then and had more money. And this particular letter is to a fellow missionary in Chandon, Ohio, who had previously served in other exotic places like Haiti, Cuba, and Thailand. The letter is very, very interesting. We don't have time to go through it, but he in detail describes all the Hindu traditions and ceremonies, exquisite detail. He also spends a lot of writing on the Brahmins and the role of the Brahmins play in the society among the Indians. And they are revered by Hindus, but they also are blamed by him as ones promoting falsehoods and misleading beliefs, which made it difficult for him as a missionary to spread the gospel of Christ. At the same time, he began to realize that maybe the British conquest of India was neither fair nor just to India. So he's one of the early Americans who began to question the morality or the reasonableness of that. This particular letter was sent privately in Nagar to Ahmednagar. It was carried privately to Boston, and once it landed in 75 days in Boston, it had to pay 10 cents domestic postage to get to Chandon, Ohio. This is another missionary well known in India and Ceylon. He was a medical missionary called John Scudder. He studied Tamil early on, and he was the first to publish a printing. He was the first to start a printing press and to publish a Bible in Tamil language. He was quite an artist, so you can see it's a hand-painted picture of an Indian or Hindu who is shown with two steel rods pierced through his body. And he writes, I think, to his niece in a long, detailed letter about how Hindus in South India believed in pleasing goddesses through a variety of extreme self-inflicted pains and other sacrifices. And there were some gory prayers that he articulated that were to goddesses. More importantly, he reported that children were abducted from large cities like Madras to be used as a sacrifice for blood for goddess. And of course, he believed clearly that Christian preaching would save these heathens. So it kind of gives you a sense of their good intentions, but their perceptions about differences. This letter was also privately carried. By the way, it was common for most missionaries to hand over their letters to either fellow missionaries traveling or the ship captains who took it as a courtesy so that they didn't have to pay expensive postage. This particular letter comes from a collector called X. Griswold. He was a very famous American collector. Now we reach to the growing interest in Sanskrit. So most people, at least I did not know until I came across this one, that the first American Sanskrit scholar was Professor Edward Elbridge, Salisbury. He came from a very wealthy family. He was an 1832 Yale University graduate, immediately got immersed into Sanskrit and Arabic languages, and he was the first professor of Sanskrit and Arabic at Yale, appointed in 1841. He extensively traveled. This particular letter is from his travel to Bonn, Germany, in Paris. He had gone to Germany to visit German scholar in Sanskrit lesson. By this time, the Germans were quite keen on and students of Sanskrit. And actually, they were probably even more advanced. And so did the French. So then he planned to go to Paris to buy some major libraries of Sanskrit and Arabic from other collector dealers, and to meet another French Sanskrit scholar. And he was requesting his agent in Boston to send him funds to pay for the travel and to acquire the library. It's a very traditional mail from Germany through London to Boston. It took only 31 days. And the postage was only 1 shilling from London to Boston, and the shipping fee of 6 cents. This is an interesting letter. We found out that Edward Hale was the first known American professor of Sanskrit at the government college in Benares in 1854. He had graduated from Harvard in civil engineering, but his family told him to go to India because his brother had left for India without telling anyone. He went to chase down his brother, had a bit of an accident on the ship as it was coming towards Calcutta, settled down, learned various languages, Bengali, Hindi, Sanskrit, Persian, and spent a lot of time. And by 1854, he was the first American professor appointed in Sanskrit at Banaras government. He was also the first to edit Sanskrit Vedantas, which is not well known. He was married to a daughter of an American officer, and so he spent a fair amount of time in Delhi. He talks about his college duties and interest in gardens and Indian vegetables. The way his life ended before he went back to England was in 1857. He was appointed provincial professor in Sagar Fort, and during the mutiny, he joined the British Army to restore the rule. The rates and routings are a little bit complicated. It was sent from Banaras, which is the holy city, to Calcutta, and then on to Suez in London and New York. Only took 61 days. Postage was complicated. He had to pay 6 annas postage for getting it to Calcutta, 1 shilling to England, and then when it got to the US post office, they charged 60 cents for the credit, going to 60 cents, and then 5 cents for the US postage, the 65 cents were paid by the recipient. This is the last story. By 1880s, there was a significant interest in America about India, India's culture, theology, religion, social practices. Interestingly, a Brahmin scholar called Gopal Joshi befriended a number of American missionaries, and he convinced some of the missionaries to sponsor his wife, Anandbai, to be sent to study medical college in Philadelphia. And she was the first Indian to get a medical degree as a doctor from the United States. Here we see on the left a picture of her in sari on the left, with about 2 other Asian ladies who probably also got medical degree. One appears from the Far East and the other one from the Middle East. This particular envelope has nothing to do with India other than that this is an envelope promoting a pamphlet on a lecture by Gopal Joshi in Newton, Pennsylvania, not far from Philadelphia. So the Shakespeare Club sponsored his lecture. And while he was there with wife studying, scope of the lecture was pretty comprehensive. It was social, practices, religious beliefs, marriages, funeral ceremonies, life events, political conditions, even parties. I don't know how we got that.
Wow. No, no.
We're almost done. So in summary, the history, as I saw it, dates back to 1790s. East India Company had a growing influence and that played a major role for and against American relationship. The trade with India intertwined easily with China, but American foreign affairs also had an impact. American ingenuity, we saw it from exporting ice and horses. The sailing time went down pretty fast as once the steamship came and then the opening of the overland route. So the sailing time went down from 7 months to less than 4 or 5 weeks. The consular relationship were early, but they were pretty much serving the maritime and mercantile trade. Missionaries played a very significant role as observers of religion and social cultural practices. And last but not the least, there was a growing interest in Sanskrit and Indian theology. So that's our end of our conversation and open for question and answer if there are any. Yep. Yes? Mhm. Yes, it was partly that. And what was happening is that the French and English were actually creating barriers for American traders to sail and do trading in other parts of the world. And so George Washington said, we need to retaliate to protect and promote our interests. So it was George Washington who placed an embargo against French and English ships. And then, of course, they retaliated. English said, okay, we're going to also do embargo, so your ships can't come to any of our ports or the ports we control. Yeah, true.
The embargoes were also, an indirect cause of the War of 1812.
Absolutely. Absolutely right.
But what surprises me was I saw in your presentation, which I enjoyed incidentally, thank you, but I also noticed that before the United States got its independence, apparently there was trade directly between Calcutta and the New England states, and I thought
Yes.
and one of the causes of the Revolutionary War was mercantilism. I was always
Yep.
under the impression
Yes.
that the trade first had to go from, say, Calcutta to England first, and some fees paid at that time before they could go to the United States instead of going directly to the United States.
Rajan, you wanna-
No, it had to do with the duties.
Duties,
import
yeah.
duties. And in eighteen,
tax.
in 1757, they removed duties on 1757. Yeah, they removed duties on a whole bunch of things, but not on.
Yep, that was the
Sorry,
main.
1772. That's
77.
why we had the Boston Tea Party in 1773, because
Right.
they reduced the import on they basically gave permission to the East India Company not to reimburse the English government.
Yep.
For the loss of revenue because of tea that was being smuggled through New York
Right.
and Philadelphia.
Yep.
But they did not reduce the tea imports for the people buying the tea,
Right.
and that's what caused the
Yeah,
Boston.
well, they did that to kind of reinforce sovereignty, like
Yeah, it was basically the colonies need to generate revenue.
Right.
that they had the thing on tea because we're still in charge here.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly right. Very true.
I'm a student of American history.
Mhm.
Great. Thank you for your comments.
So Ravi,
I
a
don't know
quick
if there are any other
question.
questions.
So Ravi, a quick question for you. You
Yeah.
showed the second earliest letter from India to America. What is the date of the earliest one?
The date of the earliest one, I think, is 1806. Well, let me put it this way. The earliest one that I have seen or recorded, it belongs to one of my good friends, I don't have to mention the name, his name is Mike Schwartz, very famous, well-known US classic collector. But I have been told, but I haven't seen, that there is letters known between US and India in late 1780s and 1790s, but I have yet to see it, so I can't confirm and report it as such. I only said second earliest because that's based on what I've seen and I've documented.
Right, right.
Thank you.
Well, I think it's best only to say when you've actually seen it, because sometimes people get muddled with dates.
Correct. Fair enough.
So Ravi, thank you very much for a
I think there was someone
very
else.
interesting.
Yeah,
Carol is
one more
back.
question.
Okay.
Oh. Oh, yeah. Slave, well, okay, right. So I think Rajan is also a very good student of this subject matter, but my understanding, and then Rajan, you can add it, is that
Hang on a second.
there was never a concept of slave imported from India. There was indentured labor. The British indentured labor, meaning effectively promising poor Indians that you will get free shipping and you get wages when you go to Mauritius or East Africa. In case of Mauritius, was to help with sugar plantations. In case of East Africa, mostly to build railroad in the late 19th century. But the slave trade that I think you're referring to, was primarily from Western African countries to the Western Hemisphere of the United States. And I call it Western Hemisphere because the slave trade was not just limited to America. It was extensive in Caribbean, South America. I mean, why do you think you see so many blacks in Brazil, for example? Because the Portuguese were pretty active traders, slave traders, right? So, yeah, I mean, but there was never a slave because, most Indians were, I don't think they were gullible. I don't know, Rajan, you know, that's
There's
speculation.
a lot of evidence of slavery for people from India, from southern India in particular,
Right.
and Southeast Asia by the Dutch in the Dutch East Indies.
Oh, okay.
But the Dutch practiced a lot of that.
Okay.
In terms of enslaving in the
That would be like
Asian, South
17th
Asian.
century. Right. But the large scale indentured labor began first in Mauritius, South Africa, right?
Mining in South Africa, railroad building in East
East
Africa,
right.
sugarcane in Mauritius and
And then the
Reunion and
Caribbean too.
Seychelles.
The Caribbean.
And then Caribbean, of course, replacing all the African slaves in the Caribbean and in Guyana. There's a lot of, it's a
Very, yeah.
phenomenal study to see letters actually written to or written from indentured laborers.
Yep.
1840s through 1900.
Yep.
Most of them don't make the destination in either direction because they are illiterate enough that they didn't even know how to address the letters. And
Just
so
to,
they keep bouncing around until they end up in a dead letter office.
I mean, I have a letter from 1890s from India, registered letter to a Brahmin who was sent as a teacher, imported as a teacher in Suriname. But he was an educated recipient, so that survived.
We had quite a bit of indentured labor in the United States too.
Except for China.
Well,
The
and
Irish.
and Europe.
And Irish.
My wife's parents came over to the United States between the wars as indentured labor. And what's also interesting is that the United States was the only major country that was not able to abolish slavery without a war.
Yep. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So trading those people, and they were at the board.
They were, absolutely.
This and after that.
Absolutely. Yep. Yep.
And I was just wondering if the British society or the British. Yeah. Are they involved with the?
Initially, yeah, I think they were a significant British maritime trade, and they made a lot of money. But most of their slave trade was from West Africa to Caribbean and some to southern United States, I would suspect. But mostly Americans did the job. The Portuguese did a lot of slave trade with Brazil and made a lot of money there.
And that took a lot longer. The British slave trade ended a lot earlier.
Not earlier, yeah.
I have letters from the 1870s. They're talking about slave trade between Portugal and Brazil.
And another example is that even after America banned slave trade, one of the American council representing Cuba continued to, on the side, support slave trade through Cuba. And then the British ambassador complained to the State Department, saying, by the way, one of your guys is violating, the laws of the United States and our country. So he was finally recalled there. He ended up joining the Confederacy, by the way. Anyway, thank you for everybody's interest and time. And thank you, Carol, for hosting, and Colin.
So Ravi, thank you. Carol, I think we have a break now until 3:30, is that right?
Yeah, 3:30 it looks like.
Okay, so thank you all for attending. We'll
Okay.
see you all in about 25 minutes.
Okay, we'll see you
Thank
then.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks.